Pay close attention. The news you are about to see is fulfilling Bible prophecy.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you news as it relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yeshua Hawkins. Well, we've got STDs on the rise, the NATO and Pope actually meeting once again, and Italy is reeling to and fro from yet another recent earthquake. But we're going to start off with STDs on the rise, according to a new study. That's right, the CDC has announced that infections from 3 sexually transmitted diseases have hit an all-time high. Chlamydia, the most common STD, saw a 6% increase over the previous year with an excess of 1.5 million cases, and that is just in the United States alone. Approximately 400,000 cases of gonorrhea were reported, which is a 13% increase, and syphilis saw a 19% increase for the most common type or form of the disease.
It's quite a bit, 19%.
It's quite a bit, you're right.
Well, the Nigerian government is demanding over $400 million from the Shell Petro and Development Company for alleged crude oil theft. Now, the amount represents monies not paid from the company for crude oil lifted in 2013 and 2014. Shell, a multinational company, either did not declare or underdeclared oil shipped to the United States. Now, experts say they are not surprised since multinational companies usually shortchange their host communities.
Oh, that's sad. Now, sometimes protesters can be both an obstacle and an embarrassment to the people or organizations they're protesting against. So how will most handle it? Allow it to fizzle out, address the concerns, bring in the National Guard? We'll take a look at this video and see how the government of the Philippines handled this particular protest. And we warn you, some of the images may be disturbing to some viewers.
Ayusin natin ang ating mga hanay, mga kabansahan! Ng Pasismo ng Estado, ganito po ang mga tuta. Pahiya kayo! Tama nyo!
Wow, that's terrible. Well, Defense Secretary Ashton Carter says that his country intends to keep its alliance agreements with the Philippines. Now, the remarks come on the heels of Filipino President Duterte's announcement that Manila is separating from Washington. Carter said they will continue to discuss relations. Duterte said that the U.S. has lost and he has aligned himself with China.
So he's just kind of kicking them out of the picture.
That's
there.
right.
Well, however, the Philippines trade minister says that his country will maintain, economic relations with the U.S. Now, the U.S. attaché in Manila says that Duterte is creating unnecessary uncertainty. Duterte has effectively severed 65 years of military ties with the United States by ordering U.S. troops out of the Philippines earlier this month.
Well, Kremlin spokesman says that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad must remain in office to prevent the country from falling into the lap of terrorists. He also said that the removal of Assad is thoughtless and would result in the influx of refugees as well as more terror attacks in the area. He also noted that Russia remains committed to the removal of all terrorist organizations in Syria, as well as to prevent the disintegration of a war-torn country. Now, Syria has been suffering with over 5 years of war due to the foreign-sponsored militancy and terrorism, resulting in over 200,000 lives lost and millions that have been displaced.
Wow. Well, Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May, attended her first EU summit as Prime Minister. Of course, with the UK heading for Brexit, some might expect her welcome to be not so warm. One correspondent from the BBC actually tried to get a taste of what several of the diplomats would say to the Prime Minister, and when he was asked, what is he going to say? What are your words that you're going to say to Theresa May? The diplomat said, well, are you the Prime Minister? He says, no, I'm a reporter with the BBC. And the diplomat responded by saying, well, that makes a difference. In other words, what's said in private is not what is told to the public.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah, it was pretty bold, too.
Well, even though there may be some disagreement in the UK leaving the EU, there is one thing that most came together on at the Brussels meeting, and that was punishing Russia for the ongoing situation in Syria. Now, several other members of the EU, including Theresa May, French President Francois Hollande, and German Chancellor Angela Merkel, expressed to the EU their opposition to Russia's involvement in the Syrian conflict, calling it inhumane and against the people who live in Aleppo.
In order for the EU to move forward on Russian sanctions, all members need to agree. But that wasn't the case this time, as the Italian Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, said no. He doesn't believe further sanctions against Russia would be beneficial. He said in an interview with RT, I don't think there's any need to put sanctions against Russia on the table in this context. The final documents reflect the fact that we need to exercise all possible pressure on Syria. So it's difficult to imagine that this could be done through additional sanctions against Russia.
Well, the French are also concerned with Syria. Now, Larry McGee has the facts for us concerning France's recent sanctions requests, as well as a new Russian bomber and the NATO visit to the leader of the nations. Larry, what are these three stories about?
France is requesting that the UN Security Council condemn the use of chemical weapons in Syria and impose sanctions on those alleged to be liable for the attacks. The French foreign minister was seeking international action to address the attacks which occurred in Idlib in 2015, supported by the U.S. and Britain, who are also calling for restrictions against the Syrian government for alleged use of chemical weapons. The threat of nuclear weapons is still ever present and foreboding. Russia is reported to be in the process of designing and manufacturing a new bomber capable of launching nuclear weapons from outer space. Accounts reflect that the trial model of the outer space strategic bomber is slated for development by 2020. An engine for the aircraft is said to have already been tested, and images of the proposed bomber show it in high flight, capable of striking with serpentine precision. The U.S. is said to already have similar technology, and China is said to be working towards it. Obviously working towards something, the head of NATO was ushered in to meet with the head of Rome this week. Here's footage from their council, after which Katan and Jeff will pick up on the story.
Thank you. Your Holiness, thank you so much for this evening. Thank you. It's a great honor.
At the side for the photo, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
First, I'm so honored, and for me it's really an honor to meet you.
Well, very interesting. Definitely looks like they're gearing for war, no doubt. Well, about 2 weeks after his meeting with Pope Francis, Secretary General Stoltenberg spoke to NATO's defense ministers concerning directions he sees NATO and its allies headed. Well, let's listen to some of what he had to say.
Being able to be here at the NATO Defense College. Yesterday we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the NATO Defense College here in Rome, and I thanked Italy, Rome, the President, for being host nation for this very important NATO institution for so many years in this beautiful city. NATO has been successful because NATO has been able to adapt. But there is also another part of that success story, and that is that NATO has been able to build partnerships to work with countries outside the NATO alliance. This is important because it is a cooperation with countries that is multifaceted, which has many dimensions, and which requires that we use many different tools within the alliance to develop and strengthen the partnerships, both with the MD countries and the ICI countries. It's partly about that we work together in missions and activities, operations. And we have to remember that countries like Jordan, like Kuwait, being present at this panel today, but also, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Qatar, and many other countries in this region have participated in NATO operations like in Kosovo, like in Bosnia, in Afghanistan, and also in Libya. So these countries have been important when it comes to providing support, forces, capabilities to many different NATO missions and operations, and that just underlines the importance of the partnership with both the ICI and the MD. Jordan, for instance, is part of our NATO response force, underlining how close the cooperation is between some of these countries and NATO. But it's also about how NATO can project stability, work with countries in the region to project stability beyond our own borders. Soon we will inaugurate NATO ICI, the NATO ICI regional center in Kuwait, and that is really a center that will take the NATO cooperation with the Gulf countries to a new level, take the NATO cooperation with the Gulf countries to a new level, take the NATO cooperation with the Gulf countries to a new level. And I would like to thank Jacques Tamer for being the key person making that possible. And I had the honor to visit Kuwait together with Jacques Tamer some months ago, and I saw the center. It was not yet fully finished, but it's a big building, a big center, an excellent platform for taking the cooperation with the Gulf countries to really a higher and new level. We will, that will provide the opportunity, the platform, for a boost of our cooperation in areas like civil emergency planning, public diplomacy, and many other areas. Let me also add that even if that's not formally part of the Mediterranean dialogue, of course, this is also very linked to the turmoil and the instability we see in Syria and Iraq. And as you know, NATO decided at the summit in Warsaw to step up our efforts to help and support Iraq, the coalition fighting ISIL. We will soon start to provide direct support to the coalition with our AWACS surveillance planes, and we are stepping up our efforts to train Iraqi officers. And I strongly believe that for NATO, it is in the long run much better to build local capacity, to train local forces. We have started to do that in Jordan already, training Iraqi officers. We are going to start to do more of it inside Iraq early next year. And I strongly believe that in the long run that's a much more viable strategy in the fight against terrorism than deploying a large number of our own combat forces. Sometimes, or NATO has to be ready to deploy forces into big combat operations also in the future. Sometimes, or NATO has to be ready to deploy forces into big combat operations also in the future. Sometimes, or NATO has to be ready to deploy forces into big combat operations also in the future. So, just to sum up, the cooperation between NATO and with the partners in the MENA region is of great importance for NATO, I hope it is of great importance for the countries in the MENA region. It is of great importance because we face the same security challenges, and through political dialogue, to practical cooperation, and through the fact that many of the countries in the MENA region support NATO in different ways, we can continue to develop this cooperation, which is an important part of the answer to a more unstable and demanding security environment surrounding.
Well, sure seems like they're ready to use force if force is what's called for. Well, instead of making peace in the political realm, the top nation's diplomats seem to be in a war of words, accusing each other of war crimes. The U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is the leader among them, making the claim that the situation in Aleppo is, quote, the largest humanitarian disaster since World War II.
Interesting. Secretary Kerry also said the fighting there is a horrendous step back in time to a kind of barbarianism, which he said could stop immediately, quote, if Russia and Assad regime were to behave according to any norm or any standard of decency, but they've chosen not to, end quote.
Well, Virginia Senator Richard Black, however, says that Kerry is over-exaggerating because the moderate rebels who the United States have been supporting are losing ground. Senator Black seems to think it's, quote, a propaganda ploy in order to assist the rebels as much as they can diplomatically.
Secretary Kerry also tries to accuse the Russians of not going after the extremist group al-Nusra, aka al-Qaeda, which is supposed to be the focus. Well, he claims 80 to 85% of their bombing has been done against the opposition, the moderate opposition, not the extreme, but the moderate opposition in Syria. And they do that in order to support Assad under the guise of fighting terror.
But Kerry continued, they would be hard-pressed to show the number of times they have actually gone after Daesh or ISIL, and hard-pressed even when the facts are laid out to show how they have in fact bombed al-Nusra as opposed to the legitimate opposition.
Right. However, the Russian government has released data about its bombing campaign, which shows Russian operations have liberated 12,000 square kilometers of territory from terrorists, which includes hitting 30,000 terrorist targets and killing 4,900 terrorists. They also report ISIL's oil profits have been cut in half due to that is the Russian airstrikes.
So Secretary Kerry is saying, where's the proof? Russia's saying, here it is.
Right there on the table.
Well, when the U.S. State Department is questioned about their own success against the al-Nusra Front, they admit they haven't really taken any strong military action against the extremists since February or March, claiming it's because they have gotten too intermingled with civilians to really hit them hard.
So they've just been kind of laying back a little bit.
That's right.
Interesting. But Senator Black told RT the combatants which are holding out in eastern Aleppo are financed and controlled by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and the United States. These powers have the ability to pressure rebels and say, get the civilians off the battlefield, and so in effect they can go ahead and do their job.
He goes on to say how Syria is truly showing they are trying to limit civilian casualties. Syria has allowed 7 exit points. He said they made it very clear that they will care for, give medical attention, food, housing to all civilians who leave rebels, which are holding the civilians as human hostages so they can force Syria and Russia to take additional casualties.
Interesting. But the U.S. is not the only side voicing their disgust at the atrocities of war. The Russian Defense Ministry is making similar accusations aimed at the United States. They're saying the U.S.-led coalition has been committing war crimes in the country of Iraq on a daily basis.
Now, near the city of Kirkuk, as a recent example, there was a deadly airstrike led by the coalition. A mourning ceremony was taking place near a shrine in the town of Dakuk when the air bombardment began. Now, as a result, 15 women were killed and 50 more were injured. Now, U.S.-led warplanes have also carried out similar attacks in Syria. One of the worst incidents was back in September, in which Syria's eastern Dazor province was targeted. 80 Syrian soldiers were killed in that airstrike, and at least 120 others were injured.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yeah. Well, the wars that have started in and around the great river Euphrates will soon spread out and include all other nations. The only protection from these wars is not in a bunker somewhere or in the far reaches of the earth. It's in the choices we make from here on out. So contact the House of Yahweh today and find out how you can start keeping Yahweh's set appointments, the weekly Sabbaths and feast days. That's where the true protection begins.
And when you contact the House of Yahweh, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can also call them at 1-800-613-9494 or visit them on any of their websites at www.yahweh.com, www.yisroelhawkins.com, and www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit us on our website at www.ypnnews.com. You can email the House of Yahweh at info@yahweh.com. And for all calls outside the United States, please dial the number on your screen. And don't forget the greatest resource to study the Holy Scriptures available on the internet today, the Yisroel Says program. You can find that by going to www.yisroelsays.com.
Well, get ready to stand and cheer, because up next is Yisroel Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
And I'm Katan Alexander.
Thanks for watching.